Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Em. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library, and we are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's history program. I'm happy to turn it right over to tonight's speaker. Dr. Carol Gardner has more than 30 years of experience as a writer, journalist, and communicator. She earned a PhD in English from Johns Hopkins University, taught at Johns Hopkins, Wake Forest, and Florida State Universities, and has published both fiction and nonfiction pieces in a wide variety of books and periodicals, including the World of Baseball series, Blue Planet Quarterly, Northwest Review, Baltimore Review, the Women's Review of Books, Portland Press Herald, and the Washington Post. She was previously granted a Maryland Individual Artists Award, and she lives in Alna, Maine. And I will turn it over to Carol. Go right ahead.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. I'm going to share my screen here if I can have just a second. There we go. Okay. Now there are notes here, Em, about admitting people, so I guess I'm going to leave that to you. Is that okay?
Yep, I got it. Thanks, Carol.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's jump right in. I'm so happy everybody could join us tonight, and I want to thank Em and Rockland Public Library for inviting me to talk. Tonight we're going to talk about a period of time in history even more turbulent than the one we're living through now, if you can believe that. And we're going to talk about a group of Scots who came to New England by force, and these are the Scottish prisoners of 1650 and 1651. Now, I don't know all the stories of all of these prisoners. There were 422 of them, but my book, The Involuntary American, A Scottish Prisoner's Journey to the New World, discusses what life was like for a few of them. And in researching their lives, I gained a whole new perspective on early Maine and early New England society. So that's what I'd like to share with you tonight, okay? I think we're all familiar with New England's founding narrative. If you grew up as I did in New England, you were probably taught that the Pilgrims were chased out of England because of the way they worshiped, that they were looking for religious freedom, and they found it here in the New World, okay? Well, the story I'm going to tell is tonight is a little bit different from that one. In some ways, it's the inverse of it. So I'm going to run through my slides, and then as Em said, feel free to type any questions in the chat throughout, and I'll address them at the end. I also want to say that I've given this talk a number of times throughout New England. Every time I do, there are quite a few descendants of these Scottish prisoners in the audience. Okay, that's really interesting because on Zoom, it's not just people in New England that are zooming in, but it's people from as far away as Texas and Canada and Utah, California, South Carolina. So that's why these guys from 400 years ago matter, because we're all here tonight. And there's a lot of us in the audience that actually carry their DNA, okay? Anyway, let's start with the big picture. I'd like you to look at this image. And this is how I'd like you to imagine the ports of the Atlantic Basin in the 1600s and 1700s. With ships and people and goods being constantly transported back and forth between Europe, the Americas, and Africa, okay? This is really the zenith of the first global age. Now, we talk about living in a global age now, but this period of time is the beginning. And why do I say that? Well, because people were moving. They were moving everywhere. They were immigrating, they were trading, they were exploring, and there was a lot of communication among the continents, okay? It was, admittedly, it was a lot slower than it is now, but still it's the beginning, and people were really quite, moving around quite a bit. So here we have our Scottish prisoners. In 1650, it was late in the year, probably in December, 150 Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar arrived in Boston. And about a year later, 272 Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Worcester arrived in Boston. Now, most of these men were sold for 20 to 30 pounds each, and 62 of them immediately became property of an iron foundry. So why did they get here? What were these battles, and what caused them to be shipped away? Okay, well, these conflicts are are essential battles in the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, okay, sometimes called the English Civil Wars, but there really were three distinct kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, okay? And they were under a single ruler, Charles I. Ireland was mostly Catholic, Scotland was mostly Presbyterian, and in England, the Anglicans and the Puritans were sort of fighting over who was going to have, the political power, okay? Now, Charles wasn't a popular king among any of these groups at all, okay? He even, went to battle with some of these groups. And he said, I can't get control of all of these disparate people. Nobody listens to me. What am I going to do? So he said, okay, I'm going to make everybody worship like me. And if we all worship in the same way, then we'll all be more, cohesive. So that made everybody angry, of course, except for the Anglicans, because he was an Anglican, all right? So in 1649, Oliver Cromwell, who's a Puritan military leader, a very powerful member of Parliament, had King Charles I beheaded. And Cromwell seized control of government, okay? This is the period we call the interregnum, the period between kings, okay? Now, the Scots were livid when this happened, okay? They had fought alongside Cromwell and the parliamentarians against the king. So they didn't like Charles I at all. But nobody had asked their permission to behead him. And he was, after all, a Stuart king from the Scottish line, okay? So they were very upset. They mustered large armies to fight Cromwell and to try and reinstall the king's son, Charles II, and Presbyterianism as the predominant religion in Scotland and England. So people in the 17th century took their religion extremely seriously, okay? To make a long story short, Cromwell won both of these battles, both Dunbar and Worcester. And he captured large numbers of Scottish prisoners, as many as 10,000 at each battle. So he has 20,000 young, strapping Scotsmen on his hands. What is he going to do with them? He realizes that if he sends them home, all they're going to do is grab their weapons and come back at him, okay? So he doesn't. He has them sent away. And he ships them to places including England, France, Barbados, and right here in New England, okay? And those who were sent to America were either sold or conveyed as property. So when you look at this, it really is a case of individuals being sent to New England against their wills, largely because of religion, okay? So there's really no religious freedom here at all. In fact, when they got here, as Presbyterians, they were not permitted to worship in that way. Instead, they had to end up going every week to the Puritan meeting houses, right? Or they would get fines. Now, you might think that shipping 2 boatloads of prisoners to New England to be sold at Boston was a rare occurrence. Well, it wasn't. The fact is that many, many individuals came to New England against their wills in the 17th century. And so I want to take a minute to look at that trend, just so you can see these Scottish prisoners in their historical context. So early in the century, the Council for New England, which is a kind of advisory council to the king on New England, urged him to order magistrates across England to send, quote, the poorer sort of people to New England, okay? Now, this does not mean they entice them with free meals and free nights in local hotels, okay? What it means is they rounded them up against their wills, threw them in the holds of ships, and shipped them abroad as laborers, okay? And if you look at the rationale, it's actually the second sentence there in the first paragraph. It's very interesting. It will thereby disburden the Commonwealth of a multitude of poor that are likely daily to increase to the infinite trouble and prejudice of the public state, okay? So the state is now seeing these poor people as a real social problem. And their idea is not to feed them or to find jobs for them, but instead to ship them away, okay? The English government wasn't the only one doing that. You see in the second paragraph that Scottish government officials asked to be able to ship both men and women convicts abroad. And they wanted to ship them abroad, not just ship them abroad, but ship them abroad with the first conveniency, meaning as quickly as possible. Let's get these people out of here, okay? Sadly, children were a part of this trend. In his journal, John Winthrop, who's the founder and governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, writes about 20 unaccompanied children arriving in Massachusetts, with many more to come after. So these children, young children, were shipped without parents, without guardians, alone in the hold of a ship here to New England. Okay. It's also important to know it was a very rigorous trip, and as many as 10% of passengers on these transatlantic trips at the time would die. As you can imagine, these children, mostly orphans and indigent children, also became laborers in New England. And there was such a need for servants and laborers here that the trade in servants became a really profitable enterprise, and kidnapping rings developed throughout the British Isles during the 17th century. So if you lived in port cities like Bristol or London or Aberdeen, you better hang on tight to your kids, okay? And the fact of the matter is they didn't just take kids, they also took adults when they could. Now, sadly, Winthrop also, if you read on in his diary, you can see that he documents the death of one of these children, a young boy named Nathaniel Sewell. And he documents the trial of his master, who was found guilty of causing the boy's death through harsh treatment. So it is no picnic to be shipped to New England in the 17th century, okay? Africans were also part of this trend. This is the receipt for sale of a young Black girl named Lucy to a man in Boston named Robert Sharp, okay? And although the receipt is from 1745, this is some 95 years after the period we're talking about, there were plenty of African slaves in New England in the 17th century. We think one of the first to own slaves was a man named Samuel Maverick, who lived on Noddle's Island in Boston Harbor. And he had slaves there as early as 1638. Now, if you don't know Noddle's Island, I'll bet you many of you have been there, because it's the current day location of Logan Airport. Okay, so just remember that. That's one of the first places where African slaves were held in New England. Now, Maverick's not the only one in New England who held slaves. Massachusetts Bay Governor Simon Bradstreet, who's the husband of poet Anne Bradstreet, he held slaves. Cotton Mather, who's a prolific historian, clergyman from a very powerful, politically powerful family, he received an African slave as a gift from his congregation. So you can see where slavery stood in the eyes of even the most pious Puritans at the time. And Maine and New Hampshire had their share of African slaves too. The Shapley and Pepperell families of Kittery, Captain Brian Pendleton of Saco, and the influential Cutts family of Maine and New Hampshire all held African slaves in the mid-1600s. And they were not alone. And it's important at this point for me to point out that Africans had a very different experience from other kidnapped individuals, okay? So just because you were kidnapped doesn't make you a slave, right? And here's why. I've heard people talk about our Scottish prisoners as slaves, and I think that's inaccurate. And the reason is this, because most Africans that were shipped here became slaves for life. And in most cases, their children became property of the master upon being born, okay? This simply wasn't the case for any European individuals that I'm aware of, okay? In most cases, white individuals had finite terms of servitude, like our Scottish prisoners. They had 6, 7, or 8 years of servitude, and then they were free. Moreover, they were prohibited from marrying while servants. But if they did have children, and a number of them did have children out of wedlock, those children would be born free. Okay, so it's an important distinction for us to keep in mind. So this is simply to show that banishment and forced labor was a pretty common punishment for political prisoners at the time. You can see our 422 soldiers are here at the top. But at the same time, there were 1,300 captives from the Battle of Worcester who ended up in Barbados. And at the end of the century, 277 participants in Argyll's Rising were sent to Jamaica and New Jersey. Now, those are just Scots. And those are just the ones I've found, okay? So imagine when you add people of other ethnicities and people who could really dig into it, you would find thousands of people being shipped here against their wills. And you probably didn't know that as many as 1,000 Native American combatants were also shipped away from New England as servants after the Pequot and King Philip's Wars. And they were shipped to places like the Caribbean and Madeira, where they also became servants. So what's going on here? Well, governments, whether we're talking about the colonial government in New England or we're talking about European governments, are engaged in a kind of social engineering, and that is moving populations around, trying to solve social problems. So our Scottish prisoners were a part of that larger trend. So now I'm going to look a little more closely at our prisoners and talk about what life was like for them once they arrived here. And the picture is snowy because, of course, as I said, I think they arrived in late December, at least the ones from Dunbar did. And one of the first things that happened was 62 of them became property of an iron foundry. Now, this iron foundry was called Hammersmith, and it had two campuses in Saugus and Braintree, Massachusetts. And these are some of the earliest industrial sites in North America. And as you can imagine, iron at the time was extremely important for pots, tools, weapons, hardware, everything. Okay. And before Hammersmith was established in the 1640s, all those items had to be imported from Europe, which made them extremely expensive. As you can imagine, the industrialists who founded this company essentially were really happy to have these free labor, So this is the Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site. This is where they worked. It is a reconstructed replica of the original campus on the Saugus River. And I suspect it's quite accurate because they've done archaeological digs here, and there are also some of the ironworks papers still exist. So they were able to construct this from that. It would have been winter when they arrived, and immediately they would have been put to work felling large numbers of trees, cutting and curing the wood, making charcoal for the ironworks furnaces. And in summer, they mined the ore by digging into sodden, marshy earth and extracting it. You can see here, this is the Saugus River in the foreground, and around the edges, it's extremely marshy. And they would be, up to their waists digging this ore out of the muck during the summer. Okay, so all of this is very heavy and unpleasant work. We do know that they received meals, clothing, and shelter. We know that they slept together, two to a bed in large bunkhouses. And I've given you some indication on the left here from the ironworks papers of things that they ordered for them to eat, okay? And the fact is that they probably ate better in New England than they had in a long time. And this is why. As prisoners of war, they had been marched from Dunbar at the end of the battle in Dunbar. They had been marched from Dunbar to Durham in England. Marched, meaning they had to walk, and it was 100 miles. During that period, they were given no food and no water. Okay. Moreover, these men had fasted 2 days before the battle, because that's how you prepared yourself for battle in those days. So this is 4, 5, 6 days or 7 days of no food and no water. And they're marching 100 miles, and they're getting onto the ground and drinking from the mud puddles and whatever they can do. And they're dropping like flies, obviously, from dysentery, dehydration, and malnutrition. Even when they got to Durham Cathedral, where they were held as prisoners, they were fed, but they continued to die. Okay. It's in addition to this, it's important to point out that they were raised also during some of the very leanest, worst times in Scotland, during some of the worst famines and droughts in the country's history. So this was the period when they were growing up, the beginning of the 17th century, of the Little Ice Age. And it was a period of very severe weather, sort of like what we're entering into now. And it caused all of these famines and droughts. And when they did, so there are mass graves that were found at Durham Cathedral in 2013 of the soldiers who did not survive. And they dug up those graves and they studied the bones of these Scotsmen, and they found diseases of scurvy and rickets and stuff, written into their skeletons. And they had suffered with these diseases since they were children. Okay, so this is a tough period of time. I promised you that was the case. Okay, when they get to New England, there's no indication that they were used particularly cruelly, but they had been forced into exile, away from their families, away from their home, and they were also considered property of the country, of the company. Okay. Now, another group of these Scottish prisoners were sold to sawmills throughout the Piscataqua region. Okay, most of you who live in Maine and New Hampshire know that the Piscataqua River is the boundary between the two states. But when you look at this map, I'd prefer you look at this as a whole region, because that's the way it was considered on both sides of the river. It was called Piscataqua, right? And I want you to look at the river and its tributaries, not as any kind of dividing line, but as a series of highways, because that's how people got around. The roads were few and far between and very, very poor, right? So most people got around by boat. Now, if you look down here at the Squamscott River at Exeter, 7 to 8 Scottish prisoners were sold to a man named Nicholas Lisson for his sawmill. And Lisson's interesting because we believe he's a Scottish Presbyterian who emigrated voluntarily around 1637. Now, all 3 of his daughters married Scottish servants that he purchased from the battles of Dunbar and Worcester. Okay, so he gets a very good deal. He's able to purchase these men to work in his sawmill, so he has laborers, but he also has husbands for his daughters. Okay. Now, one of these men was John MacBean, and later shortened his name to John Bean. He actually married Hannah Lisson. And the reason that I bring them up is because these are the original American ancestors of LL Bean. Okay. There are a lot of these, a lot of famous people actually, come from some of these people. And another person you'd be surprised to find is Marilyn Monroe. She was also the descendant of one of these Scottish prisoners. But at any rate, I think the marrying of Lisson's servants with his daughters suggests that Scots, regardless of class, stuck together here on the New England frontier, and they supported one another. Now, Oyster River is present-day Durham, New Hampshire, and there, as many as 18 Scottish prisoners ended up at Valentine Hill's mill. Now, Valentine Hill was not a Scot. He was a well-connected Puritan merchant. And Thomas Doughty, who's the main character in my book, was purchased by Valentine Hill, and he worked there at Oyster River. From 15 to 25 Scottish prisoners worked at the Great Works sawmill at Newickawanack, which is present-day South Berwick, Maine. You'll see it there, also called Unity Parish. And the reason it's called Unity Parish is because the Unity was the ship that these prisoners came over on. Okay. There were a few other sites, sometimes there were Scots that were sold to individual farmers or small workshops in New England, but I'm sort of giving you the largest groupings of them. Now, the Scots in Piscataqua were also engaged in very physical labor. In winter, they'd cut trees by hand using saws and axes, and they'd haul them from the woods with teams of oxen. In spring and summer, they'd transport the logs downstream to sawmills for processing and shipment. Okay. It sounds straightforward. It's very dangerous and very grueling work. Imagine trying to lead oxen over icy slopes with gigantic logs like the one you see here in front of you. Okay, it was very dangerous. At least 2 Scottish prisoners died from having trees and limbs falling on them. And at least 2 more died from drowning while trying to float these logs downstream. Okay. But lumber mills, like the ironworks, were essential to the settlement of New England and to the other American colonies. Wood was used, well, a lot of wood was shipped away to the Caribbean because they had run through their forests very quickly. But a lot of wood stayed here too, and it was used for everything, for building homes, mills, meeting houses. It was the fuel for heating and cooking, and it was even used as currency because there were so few English pounds circulating on the frontier here. Court cases and disputes would be settled by saying, well, so-and-so has got to pay the other guy so many board feet or so many pipe staves. Okay. Now, by the 1670s, some 20 years after our Scottish prisoners arrived, this area was positively booming with sawmills. And that's why I give you this quote from William Hubbard, who says that there was at least one sawmill on every river and stream along the coast. And in fact, if we go back for a second, I'll give you an example. So between Exeter, New Hampshire, and York, Maine is a distance of 25 miles, okay? We know that in the 1670s, there were 15 sawmills just in that distance. We don't know how many there were between, say, York, Maine, and Casco Bay, Maine, but there had to be at least another dozen, right? So the virgin forests are disappearing fast. And at this point, you have to put yourselves in the shoes of Native Americans, right? It has to be really alarming for them to see these virgin forests just being systematically chewed up, right? Now, for the most part, the Scots of Piscataqua were very quiet in the court records during their periods of servitude. And this suggests that they were under kind of a tight rein, right? But this is one example which shows what could happen when they were disobedient. Alexander Maxwell was a Dunbar prisoner of war, and he had a disagreement with his master at the Great Works sawmill. So he was publicly whipped. You can see 30 lashes were given him on the bare skin. He was thrown in jail, and he was forced to compensate his master for the time away from work and for his board while he was in the local jail. And the threat for committing a second offense was that he could be sold to Virginia, Barbados, or anywhere they wanted to. Well, let me just sort of underline what kind of a threat that is. Okay, Barbados is we currently think of it as a kind of a resort, right? In the 17th century, it was anything but that. It was a kind of a hell on earth. And the reason is because it was the center of English sugar production. Okay, so there were these huge sugar plantations, and they had plenty of servants, and you did not want to be sold there because it was hot. Tropical diseases ran rampant, and the servant culture was much, much more brutal. Okay, so I've read statistics that say from the time they stepped onto the island, servants' life expectancy would be 2 years. Right? So they were constantly trying to replace these guys. But I have some good news for you. Maxwell survived this controversy, and he gained his freedom around 1657. Okay, so like him, after 6 or 7 or 8 years of labor, the Scottish prisoners were set free. So what did they do? To me, the most interesting fact is that we don't know of a single one of the 422 who returned home. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. But we do know one thing that they did right away. And that is, in Boston in January of 1657, 28 Scots, including several former prisoners of war, founded the Scotch Charitable Society. Now, this is founded just as they're emerging from their terms of servitude, right? So they didn't have families, they didn't have other community supports, and they frankly feared for their welfare in this strange country, right? So they got together and they decided, okay, well, we'll make small payments every month, 1 or 2 pence into a kitty, and we'll decide as a group who needs that money. Okay, and the records still of this organization still exist, at least to some degree. Okay, and you can read over them and see what happened to the money. And in fact, they often gave money for burial fees for indigent Scots, for Scots who couldn't afford to bury themselves. And they also gave money to widows, because of course, if you're a widow in 17th century New England, you have a very, very hard time, right? Now, this organization still exists today. Okay, and it's the oldest ongoing charitable organization in North America. So these prisoners left behind more than their DNA, right? They left behind their institutions as well. Now, continuing with this idea of what did they do once freed, I've given you a quote from the Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641. Now, you have to think of this as a kind of a constitution for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it dictated that servants, upon finishing their terms of servitude, quote, shall not be sent away empty. Okay, so if a fellow works for you for 7 years, and you can't just say, okay, goodbye and good luck, right? You have to give him something for those years of service, right? So many Scottish prisoners received land grants. And this is revolutionary, because had they remained in Scotland, it would have been virtually impossible for any of them to acquire their own land. Okay, land was held by lairds and clan chiefs, and it just simply wasn't available for the average individual. The question was, did the English really have the right to grant lands to their former servants? And at this point, I think it's really important to acknowledge that all of New England, wherever you're sitting or standing right now, was and is Indigenous land, right? And the English, of course, had a motive for granting parcels to British subjects. Let's think about that. If you're a wealthy merchant, let's say, and you live in Boston or Salem, and you give a former servant a parcel of land in an outlying area, you know it's the best opportunity he's going to have in his lifetime, and he's going to defend that land with everything he's got. Well, what does that mean for you? It means he's your gatekeeper, he's your sentry guard. It makes you all the more secure, right? Now, so this is simply to show you that in both Oyster River and Unity Parish, quite a number of these Scottish prisoners got land grants, either from their masters or in some cases from the town. One exception is Thomas Doughty. Thomas Doughty got a sum of money at the end of his servitude. So what did he do with that? Did he use that to purchase a passage back to Scotland? And the answer is no. He turned right around and purchased land on the Oyster River across from where his master lived, his former master lived. Okay, so this points to something really important. Land is an extremely important reason for people coming to New England, and extremely important for their staying here. At least, if not more so, more important than religious freedom. Okay. Early in the 17th century, the English and the Europeans and the Scots, everybody, they arrive on ships and they look out from those ships, and what do they see? They see forests, practically right down to the shoreline, right? And they're thinking from their European perspective, oh, look at all this vacant land. We could really use this, right? We could make good use of this. But of course, the land wasn't vacant, okay? The indigenous peoples had been living there for generations, and they liked it the way it was, okay? And so there started to be two visions for this land. The European vision involves individual ownership, right? Everybody owns his own plot. Leveled forests, fenced in farms, mills, dams, and permanent settlements, a lot like the way we live today, okay? The Native American vision included intact woods for hunting habitat, right? Open agricultural fields. So they did clear fields, and they did, engage in agriculture. Open rivers that allowed migrating fish to come and go. Seasonal settlements, sometimes they would, in the winter, they would go inland for hunting. In the summer and spring and summer, they go to the shore for fishing. But most important of all is that they had a more communal sense of ownership. They did think of the land as theirs, but it didn't belong to individuals. It didn't belong to Madakawando or Squando or Sheepscot John. It was ours, not mine. Okay, and so these two visions are going to, create conflicts sooner than later here in the New England frontier. Now, while many of these former Scottish prisoners farmed the land that they received, Thomas Doughty did not. He trained as a lumberman under Valentine Hill. So he took his land, he cut the timber on the land, he sold it to local sawmills, and then he sold the cleared land as farmland. And because the forests were disappearing fast in Piscataqua, which we've already talked about, Doughty moved north into Maine, looking for other opportunities. He first moved to Berwick, the Berwick area, and then he moved even further north to Saco. And so the Scots, like Doughty, formed tight-knit communities here on the frontier. As many as 25 are thought to have settled at Unity Parish. An area in nearby York came to be called Scotland because of the number of prisoners who settled there. The Scots also settled at Kittery, Wells, and Saco in Maine, and at Exeter and Oyster River in New Hampshire. And they didn't settle alone, they settled in groups. Okay, and in fact, they lived together frequently. Many Scots lived together before being married and some even after being married. Okay, they engaged in joint work contracts, and you see them standing up for one another in court. Right? So they're a very close-knit group. Now, after 15 to 18 years of building their livelihoods, they face a new conflict. In 1675, King Philip's War broke out in Massachusetts. On one side of the conflict were the Wampanoags, led by Metacom or King Philip, and on the other were the English and their allies. Now, it's important to say there were native communities on both sides of this war, so it wasn't a strictly ethnic war. But in large part, the issue behind the conflict was land. Okay, the natives felt, particularly the Wampanoags lived in like South Shore, Cape Cod area, which was one of the first places to be settled. And so it was just getting denser and denser with Englishmen, right? And the Wampanoags were like, being really kind of pushed out. And they would take their cases to English courts, and guess what would happen? They would lose, right? So war breaks out. And like all other able-bodied men, the former Scottish prisoners were required to join local militias and fight alongside the English. And for most of these men, this was the third war that they'd been involved in, or at least witnessed during their lifetimes. And here are some who were on the front lines. William Colquhoun was one of the founders of Swansea, Massachusetts, which is where the fighting first broke out. Okay. And he was one of the war's earliest casualties. John Wattles had been captured at the Battle of Worcester, shipped to New England, and after servitude, he settled in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. Now, although he died in King Philip's War, we know he did leave children behind. And how do we know that? Because filmmaker Michael Moore is his direct descendant. Okay. I got that fact from the PBS show Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates. So I don't know if you watch that, but I sure do. So that's kind of interesting. On the eastern frontier, Thomas Doughty, as it says here, was burned out of his mill and his home. He had a family at that point with probably had 3 or 4 children, young children, and was burned out of his home and his mill. And he went south and moved in with 2 other of his former friends, former Scottish prisoners in Wells, Maine. Okay. But in 1678, a treaty is signed, and people start to be optimistic that both sides will be able to get along. So Thomas Doughty returned from Wells to his former home in Saco, and he rebuilt. Okay, and he began doing quite a booming lumber business there at the Saco Falls. And the reason we know he was doing a good business is because he was being taxed higher than most of the other sawmills in the area. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last that long. It lasted only about a decade. And then the violence breaks out again. And King William's War pitted the English and their subjects, including the Scots, of course, against the French and the Wabanakis. Now, the Wabanakis are the native communities in New Hampshire and Maine. And you can see from this map, the orange area is where most of the Wabanaki French raids occurred. And the former Scottish prisoners who'd settled at Piscataqua were right in the hot seat. Okay. In 1690, Fort Loyal, which is present-day Portland, Maine, was destroyed, and all the English settlers in the area were taken out and shot. Okay. That doesn't mean that the French and the Wabanaki were the only ones, committing atrocities during this war. The English gave as good as they got, believe me. But what's interesting is that the English were really pushed back. So they were pushed all the way back to Wells, Maine. And they, for 3 decades, there were no English settlements north or east of Wells, Maine. So this was a big deal. Now, once again, the problem was land. In Maine, the English had signed a treaty at the end of the previous war saying that they wouldn't expand their lands. And you can imagine how they abided by that, right? In addition, their cattle were getting loose. They were destroying the natives' corn and cultivated fields. And they were not only damming the rivers, but they were placing large nets at the mouths of the rivers, particularly the Saco River. And these rivers provided critical sources of food, with migrating salmon, shad, herring, and other fish, which the native populations depended upon heavily. So the natives are saying to themselves, what are we going to do? The English are trying to starve us out. They said, what we'll do is we'll ally with the French, who treat us marginally better than the English, and they're also engaged in a territorial war with the English. And so they attacked settlements, English settlements up and down the coast. Many former Scottish prisoners, as well as others, died in these raids, and some were actually captured and marched all the way, say, from the Piscataqua region to Quebec. And when I say marched, meaning they went on foot, right? And it was winter in many cases. It was not pleasant. So a lot of them died along the route. Some got there to Quebec and were actually ransomed back, and some ended up living there. By 1688, Thomas Doughty had a wife and 7 children, and they were forced to abandon the frontier for Salem, Massachusetts, leaving home, property, and livelihood behind. So they were joined by scores of refugees. And if you've read anything at all about Salem history, you'll know that the refugees streaming in at this time and their constant dire reports of violence on the eastern frontier were key events that helped to precipitate the Salem witch crisis of 1692. So here again at age 58, Thomas Doughty becomes a refugee and he's forced to start life over. Okay. One of the reasons I wanted to focus my book on him is because here's a fellow born in 1630 in extremely humble circumstances in rural Scotland, and he's illiterate. And I would have thought, before I did this research, that someone like that would end up spending his entire life within a dozen miles of his home. But Doughty didn't. He was sort of swept up in the maelstrom of this first global age, right? And war forced him to immigrate 3,000 miles from home to America. Once he arrived here, war forced him to abandon his home and his livelihood 2 more times. And economic concerns compelled him to move another 5 times. Okay, so it's a very insecure, very difficult existence. And I'm not going to tell you what happened to Thomas Doughty in the end, because that would be a disincentive for those of you who haven't read my book to read it. So, but anyway, I've tried to give you a flavor of the culture in which the Scottish prisoners lived and the obstacles that they were up against. If you'll give me just a couple more minutes, I promise it won't take long. I'm going to take you on a little field trip, a little tour of a few present day sites that demonstrate how the Scottish prisoners influenced New England culture, past and present. And we've already talked about this one. You can visit it. It's there in Saugus, Massachusetts, and more than 60 Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar were employed here. If you're ever in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I recommend you take a walk in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's a beautiful cemetery with rolling hills and mature trees, and you'll come across this fence. And I don't know if you guys can see it on your screens, but it says Scots Charitable Society, Boston, instituted AD 1657. Okay. Remember we talked about how that society provided for the burial of indigent Scots? Well, inside this fence are said to be buried 220 individuals without headstones or other markers. And this elegant fence serves as the memorial for them and for their mutual support for one another. So this is an operating inn in Durham, New Hampshire. I've stayed there. You can also stay and have a meal, whatever. The original structure on the site was built as early as 1651. And in fact, there's a piece of it I think you can see out behind this main facade. And it was likely built by Scottish prisoners from the Battle of Dunbar, including Thomas Doughty, as a home for their master, Valentine Hill. It sits above the Oyster River, which you can see here on the right. And that's where Hill and his Scots built one of the earliest sawmills in New Hampshire. This is one of the oldest houses in Maine, probably built around 1707 and used as a garrison during the French and Indian Wars. Now, the first Scotsman to own this land was actually Alexander Maxwell. And you remember, he was the guy who got into trouble, was whipped and thrown in jail. He was granted this land, okay? And then he sold it to John McIntyre, who's the son of another Scottish prisoner. And McIntyre is believed to have built this garrison. And because of it, and because of the settlement of numerous Scots in this part of York, the neighborhood became known as Scotland. So finally, we have Doughty Falls. Thomas Doughty, the central character in my book, built the original dam on the Great Works River in North Berwick. And in fact, the town of North Berwick was once known as Doughty Falls. Now, throughout Casco Bay, Maine, the Doughty name is very, very common. And I suspect that the vast majority of those people are direct descendants, whether they know it or not, are direct descendants of Dunbar Scott, Thomas Doughty. Okay, so that's all I have for you tonight, except a recommendation for a couple of books if you're interested in reading more. The second one's particularly good, but in addition, I think, no, the first one's actually really interesting too, because that's about the archaeological dig where they dug up the remains of those Scottish prisoners who didn't make it out of Durham. And the scholars go into quite a bit of detail about these Scottish prisoners. So thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it. And now I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Carol.
Thank you.
We have a few in the chat so far, mostly talking about you had mentioned in previous talks that descendants often come to the talks. And we have a few of those in the chat. We have Karen, who said, I'm one of those descendants who was fortunate enough to attend this program live a few years ago. I asked a question about my guy, surnamed Gray, and a few other audience members spoke up and said that he was their ancestor too. It felt like a mini family reunion. And then Christine mentions in the chat that she is also a Gray relation. So I thought that was fascinating.
Let me tell you, the Grays are extremely prolific from all I can tell, okay? Because I get a lot of information. I get a lot of emails and lots of contact from the Grays, so.
We also have Deborah, who said that she is descended from William Tosh McIntosh, who was in the Battle of Worcester. One is descended from Duncan Stewart and William Furbish. And Patrick said that he is descendant of David Comey, born in 1635 and shipped to the New World on the William and Sarah, which arrived in 1652, as he recalls. And he mentioned, as you were discussing King Philip's War, that David was killed in King Philip's War. Karen notes in the chat, is it time for a book about the Grays? That would be fun.
Well, one of the descendants is going to have to write that book. I can't do it.
That would be fantastic. Sam mentions, thanks so much. Although my school classes never lit the fire of making history fun and interesting, the Outlander series certainly did. Fascinating business. Thank you. And Mary asks, is there a good resource to trace these Scottish families? I am a descendant of George and Gray and James Warren. And Michael mentions that he is a descendant of James Warren as well in the chat.
Yeah, so it's called Scottish Prisoners of War. I think it's scottishprisonersofwar.org, I think. So, but it's the Scottish Prisoners of War Society, and it's a nonprofit group. And there's a lot of genealogical information available on their website. And they also have a Facebook feed. So I recommend you research that, and you'll get a lot of information about them. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry, Sue in the chat says, I am a descendant of William Furbish. I was in Skye when they reburied the skeletal remains, and I'm going to Scotland or Durham in May. And Beverly mentions she is a descendant of both Thomas Doughty twice and Daniel Dill.
Wow, interesting.
Patrick asks, did I hear Carol say that she also wrote a book? Yes, The Involuntary American.
I did.
Talk a little bit more about that first.
Here it is. There you go. So, yep. And it's available, everywhere. Yeah, I recommend, looking at your local, ordering it through your local bookstore, but if you want to order it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, it's also available there.
Jay and Kathy say our Moore ancestor may have been an Irishman, Samuel Moore, who was with his brother Matthew, may have gone to Scotland to fight the English at Dunbar. Are you aware of Irish Presbyterian volunteers in these battles? Samuel and Matthew appear in Newbury, Mass. In 1635 or 53. Sorry,
1653. Well, I'm not so. Well, this is a very complicated issue because, of course, there were Scots who were sent to Ireland to try and resettle parts of Ireland because they were really trying to wrest power away from the Catholics. Okay, so they were called the Ulster Scots. Now, it's possible that at that time that some of those Ulster Scots did come back and fight, but I'm not aware of it. There were many Ulster Scots who ended up in New England, and they came a little bit later, starting around, I believe, 1712. But they're spread all over, their descendants are spread all over New England as well.
I saw a question a moment ago, and it seems to have. Oh, there it is. Jean asks she asks where one might find access to the prisoners' lists. I understand all 422 prisoners are discernible in records of these lists.
Yeah, those lists are spotty, but yes, they still, I would still say Scottish Prisoners of War.org is a good place to start. The last I knew, they had published both lists, both the Dunbar prisoners and the Worcester prisoners on their website. There's also a list at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, a handwritten list, but that's just of the Dunbar prisoners. And I do believe that in the Essex County, Massachusetts legal records of the time, you can find the most complete list we have of the Worcester prisoners as well.
Karen also notes a great resource in the chat. Maine Ulster Scots Project in Maine is another terrific group. They collaborate with a lot of folks from Ulster, Ireland, and have done several programs.
Right.
And Margaret asks, I know that the indentured Scots sometimes received land grants from the towns where they lived. Did their masters also sometimes grant the men land after their service?
Yes, and in fact, I tried to point out that they did get land from both of those sources, both from the towns and from their masters. The fact of the matter is that some of these men became very important, or very, shall we say, very successful residents of their towns and well liked, and the towns would grant them land frequently. So some of them did very well.
Let's see, any other questions or comments in the chat? Patrick asks, will we be able to get a copy of this talk with the PowerPoint? It will be recorded and added to our YouTube page. We're just Rockland Public Library on YouTube if you want to search that. But any other questions or comments? Oh, interesting question from Jane. Is it fully accurate to make a complete distinction between the Puritans and the Presbyterians?
Yes, it is. Two very distinct, sects. I think that, as I said, obviously they were in opposition during this war. There's no question about it. During the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, it was really the Presbyterians versus the Puritans. Okay, and as I said, when the Scots came here, they pretty much had to worship as Puritans because that was required by law. There was no such thing as religious freedom in New England at the time. It may be that these guys got together quietly in a back room and did some worshiping in the Presbyterian style, but for the most part, they had to show up at meeting every Sunday.
Christine asks, do the Scottish I don't know how to pronounce that.
Covenanters.
Covenanters figure into this history.
Yes, in fact, that's basically what the Scottish Army called themselves, the Covenanters. Okay, so they had a covenant whereby they were supporting Charles II and the institution of Presbyterianism, right? So that's the army themselves. They were the Covenanters for sure. Yes.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments? I think we'll get ready to wrap it up then. Margaret notes, wonderful talk. Thanks so much in the chat. And I would like to echo that. Thanks so much, Carol. This has been really fantastic. What an excellent talk.
Thank you. I'm very happy. Yeah, so good luck, everybody. Thanks again for showing up. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. And thanks so much, Carol, for joining us tonight. And have a wonderful night, everyone.
All right, you too. Thank you. Bye.